give honor and respect to the Four Directions group in Southern California, and the physical transition of Chief Ernie Longwalker. His ashes were spread there at the Red Wind compound yesterday. We were in that area. We had an APRP delegation there to show our support. We've worked with Four Directions for a number of years, and I think that they are a wonderful example of genuine indigenous resistance to colonialism and to the oppression of the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere. When you drive onto their 250 acres, that's out in the middle of the country out there, you have a sign that says you are leaving the United Snakes of America and entering indigenous land. And this is the spirit that Chief Ernie Longwalker gave to us. And I think that we lose a lot of our elder warriors like that. And I think that's at least part of the reason why, there's so many wonderful young new activists, but they lack the knowledge and experience of people like Chief Ernie Longwalker. So if you don't know who he is, you should study him and Four Directions, Warrior Woman. You should know about them. They are wonderful representatives of the dignity of the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere. And we honor our African ancestors always. Always we do that. They are the reason that we're here. We struggle for this work because of the legacy that they have provided to us. And they always operated from a position of dignity. A lot of people miss that today, but just because they miss it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. The dignity never left. It's always been here. I don't care how much coonery and foolish stuff that they throw at us and attempt to pretend that that's a representation of the African masses. We know better. So we are honored to carry on this legacy of our ancestors. And we want you to know that Our Ancestors' Voices, is a weekly program, again, sponsored by the All African People's Revolutionary Party, same time, same place every week. And then you can watch the videos on YouTube after the programs are completed. And the African People's Revolutionary Party is an independent mass Pan-African revolutionary party with its base in Africa. We fight for Pan-Africanism, revolutionary Pan-Africanism, which we define as the total liberation and unification of Africa under a scientific socialist government, a collective scientific socialist government. And we don't stutter when we say that. We know that that is exactly what we need as African people, and we are 100% dedicated to fighting for that objective. And if you want to understand more about our objective of revolutionary Pan-Africanism, a great place to start is Kwame Nkrumah's Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare, which details the strategy to unite all of the revolutionary Pan-African formations on the ground throughout Africa. So we are certainly a part of that work and contributing to it in the best way humanly possible. And we will continue to do that work. And we want to say that this program is one of many programs sponsored by the All African People's Revolutionary Party. We encourage you to check them all out. There is not an overabundance of revolutionary Pan-African truth-telling taking place, and those sources that gain momentum, like Africa Stream, are sabotaged by international imperialism. And so the best defense against that is to support these efforts to tell the truth about what's going on in the world. So support all of our programs, support any other truth-telling program that's happening. And we thank you for joining us today. And to get us started, I turn it over to Shakur.
Thank you. Appreciate you. Greetings, everyone. We hope you are well. So I have one slide right before this one. It's not really necessary for you to see it. It's more so of a background. As we always do, we try to give kind of the base foundation information. So before I get to the current slide that you probably do see, I just wanted to kind of give us a little bit more of a background since today's topic is focusing on the racist, capitalist, imperialist, propagandized ideologies that we have been taught and that we are receiving as it relates to the AIDS outbreak, not just on the continent, but how it's impacting Africans everywhere because of the rhetoric that has been spewed about AIDS and the disparities that are taking place with the continent. And so, just in kind of understanding that, I think we first need to kind of break down what is the intention behind spewing that nonsense rhetoric? Like, what is the benefit of capitalism, imperialism, systems that are anti-human? What is the purpose of them putting out rhetoric that's simply not true, especially as it relates to African people? Well, we know that we've talked in great detail about how capitalism works really hard to focus on messaging, right? And for some of us, we might even study communication to the point where we really start to understand exactly how messages are formed. And so, kind of understanding that, we would also understand that capitalism is the intention of, protecting private corporations so that they can continue to make money, especially as it relates to them being able to control the resources and how the production occurs with those private entities and organizations. So that also means that they can control the messaging that they're sending to you. That means that they can control the propaganda and how the message is formed when it is sent to you, which means you may not have ever gone to Africa. But deep, 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 deep down in your memory, in your brain, in your repertoire, in your self conscious, you probably have some racist ideology down there, even if you are African, where you're trying to understand something about the concept of AIDS. And you might even be wondering, why is it such an issue with Africans on the continent, even if you've never been there and you've never studied it, because the delicate recipe for crafting that kind of message has happened for centuries. And capitalism has had a lot of practice in terms of what that message looks like in terms of framing it, right? And so we must understand the whole purpose of framing the message is to make sure that the intention is to further exacerbate the issues with Africa, to further exacerbate why Africa is incapable and the African people are incapable, and that they are poor and that they are suffering and that they are less than and that they are this and that they are that. So it takes you away from really understanding how rich Africans and Africa is. That's the intention behind the message. If you had any idea just how rich the continent was, you would not be sitting so quietly in terms of allowing other exploiters to take over, because you would understand that Africa deserves for you to fight for it. If you really understood how rich the continent was, if you really understood how much the people of Africa deserve to be respected, then you would be fighting for them, right? So that's exactly the point we're making, is propaganda is so good at keeping the truth from you all that this is why we encourage you all to increase your political education, because the systems that we live in are designed to maintain withholding information from us. That is their literal purpose, to withhold information from us. And if we don't have the wherewithal to understand that we need to seek the information that is missing, if we don't have the wherewithal to understand that we cannot trust the fact that all the information that's being presented is in fact truthful, if we don't have the wherewithal to understand that we have a responsibility to look further, to seek further, to be more critical, to push back, to resist, because the system has already communicated to us that it cannot be trusted. So how many more times do we have to fall for it when we already know the truth? And that's exactly what they're banking on. is for you to continue to think that they can be trusted, for you to continue to think that they are telling you the truth. So then you're not going to push forward. You're not going to look into it deeper. You're not going to do any further research. You're certainly not going to take responsibility for accessing information. And now they don't have to worry about you because you're not a threat to their operation. You're going to fall in line and be a good person. And you're not going to get in the way of a revolution that drastically has been taking place and will continue to take place, right? We also need to understand that, there is so much profit to be gained in selling this kind of propagandized ideology that Africans are more likely to carry the AIDS virus, that Africans are more likely to be unresponsible when it comes to sexual intimacy, when it comes to needle sharing, when it comes to how the virus can be transmitted in the first place, transmission through birth, all those things. And so we kind of need to understand there is profit to be gained in selling that ideology and in us believing that that ideology is true. Because that also would cause people to be hesitant on traveling to the continent, which is another way you can increase your political education. And again, they want you to be ignorant. They want you to not travel because then you're going to get there and you're going to see how rich this continent is. And you're going to start to question things and you're going to start to put things together. And they can't allow for that. So if they continue to make you as afraid as possible, to make you fear for your life that you'll get malaria, that you'll fear for your life that you will get HIV, AIDS as soon as you get off the plane, all of those kind of things are making it harder and harder for you to make a decision about purchasing a ticket because of all the things you've heard and about all the things that you're worried about. And so these are things that we have to think about as well, because that would be the sinking hole right there. If we were to actually go back to the continent, if we were to actually have what is a true homecoming, if you understand what I'm saying, if we were to actually be able to experience that, there would be nothing stopping us. And then if we were able to go home, if we were able to go to the continent, because that is home, not the US, but actual Africa, then we would be able to see from that landscape, man, if all of this messed up stuff is happening to African people, how many other people are experiencing the same thing? Oh, now I'm starting to see the connections with the Palestinian people. Now I'm starting to see the connection with Asian descent people. Now I'm starting to see the connection with Irish descent people. Anyone who's been colonized, I see the connection. But I also see the connection with queer identifying people. I also see the connection with non-male people, differently abled, and so on and so forth. And now we have multiple opportunities to organize against the same oppressor that is impacting every single one of those groups of people. And that's how it begins. So we kind of need to understand that all of this has been designed to make it look like Africans are the problem. As I said, kind of pointing the finger at the individualized decisions that we have been making to transmit, to perpetuate, and to protect the virus from continuing to be spread. And so, if we move forward to the current slide, now that I've done my best to kind of give us a little bit of a background, then we can start to understand a little bit more that there has been such an intention with how the framing of this message has taken place, right? So we've been distracted, if you will. Instead of us actually thinking about what it means to seek solutions to the AIDS crisis, instead of looking at what that really looks like, instead of us questioning why is it that socialist Cuba does not seem to have a problem when it comes to eradicating various viruses, diseases, different illnesses, sexually transmitted diseases. They take them out and they terminate them one by one. Why is it that they don't have any issues like this? They have no issue with AIDS. They have no issue with HIV. They have no issue with cervical cancer, no issue with syphilis. But yet the United States has such a problem with AIDS, HIV, that they have created an entire day, December 1st, an entire day dedicated to the disparities. And we already know that African folks are going to have higher disparities with HIV because we don't have access to care. We don't have providers that actually listen and respect us. We don't have health insurance. We can't afford our premiums. We can't afford our copays. We can barely afford to maintain our regular doctor appointments, which would help us to prevent these things along the way. But we're not able to do that because of all the systemic oppression that's coming our way. So because of that, we are in a more tighter space. We're more likely to get sick. And so that's also a play where the system kind of understands that and it uses that to impact us. And instead of us focusing on why that is, instead of us really studying why health disparities exist and connecting the systemic oppression to it, not just the individual behavior, but the systemic oppression that comes from it, instead of us really making those connections, it's more so promoted, it's more so accepted to just say, well, you should have done this differently, or why did you do that when you knew that this was the case? But that's exactly the point. They don't want you to start to critique things. They don't want you to start to study things. They don't want you to start to question why things are what they are. Because then you're going to start to see loopholes. You're going to start to see inequities. You're going to start to see things that simply don't make sense. And you're going to start to wonder, why is it that this particular group of people continues to have all of these issues? And then you're going to be like Marcus Garvey and Kwame Nkrumah and Sekou Touré, Amilcar Cabral. Um, uh, oh my gosh, I'm forgetting my comrade's name. You're going to start to think about all these different folks, and you're going to notice, like all these folks, that there are inequities in every part of the world when it comes to African people. You're going to notice that African people in Canada are just as much struggling as Africans on the continent. Africans on the continent are just as much struggling as they are in the US. They're struggling in other parts of Australia. They're struggling in any part of the world. You're going to notice that. And you're going to see, except for Cuba, and you're going to see outside of Cuba, everywhere else they're struggling. And you're going to see that there's some serious denominators here. There's some common denominators here. You're going to see that. So they don't want you to see that. They'd rather keep you focused so that you can't start to even notice that. Because if you notice that, then you're going to be in a position where you can start to question some things. So this is where we can start to think about this a little bit more, where we can really start to break this down. And this is why we don't take into account oppression, because that's part of the issue. Is we're not acknowledging how oppression severely drives HIV rates. It severely drives the incidence, the prevalence. It severely drives the increase. It severely drives the lack of knowledge. I mean, we can blame oppression for why Africans tend to have lower health literacy when it comes to understanding even how HIV is transmitted, when it comes to understanding how HIV can not be a death sentence anymore. There are so many people who are still not having those particular conversations, and they're not understanding that there are several people who live with it. But this is not conversations that we have, because instead of having these conversations, we're focused more on the behaviors instead of understanding why this is and breaking it down a little bit more. And also this piece about individual behavior, individualism, that's really key. We need to think more about that. And shame on me, her name just came to me, Shirley Graham Du Bois. She also started to realize there were some common denominators. Shout out to Shirley Graham. So we start to see all of these pieces come together. And this is why capitalism is so promoted, because the ideology behind it is you are more likely to be protected under a capitalist system. You're less likely to get sick. And that's simply not true. That's simply not true. If anything, you're probably going to be more sick and you're going to have less protection, because you're probably not going to have the funds to protect yourself from getting sick. And if you have the funds, you may not have consistent funds, because we know that capitalism is not going to stop after they take the first couple of payments. They're going to continue to ask, because that's what that system does. It will rob you and deplete you. And when you're no longer a source of money for it, it'll move on to another source, right? So as I prepare to pass the slides back to Comrade Ajamu, I think that we need to start to really break that down, because the other piece of this, the focus on individualism, the focus on not considering how, there are inequities in all parts of the world, right? And then also this piece about not connecting to oppression, promoting capitalism, that also means that we are intentionally being propagandized to continue to see the problems of communism, the problems of socialism, because capitalism is more of an attractive economic system. But the bottom line is, in a socialist environment, in a communist environment, there would be more systems in place to protect the transmission of this virus. Because what we are starting to see, especially if you're increasing your political education and you're reading about these systems, is in a socialist environment, that's the bridge between capitalism and communism. So we don't want people to be sick with HIV, with AIDS in a socialist environment, because we understand that that could be a death sentence, and instead we want to find a way to either eradicate it completely from the system, or we want to find a way to give them the best medicine that their body can respond to, so that they can live with HIV every single day, have normal lives, work every day, go to the beach, go to the park, have a dog, have children, not have any transmission with the children, not have any transmission with the partner, and be able to exist as a human being in a happy place. That's what we want. The thing about socialism is every single person has a responsibility to contribute to the system, because the system is upholding everyone because of the collectivism. So if half the people are sick and they don't have a way to heal, then they're going to die. And if they die, that's going to impact everyone, because everyone is relying on everyone. So this is where it starts to really come into play. Capitalism is not going to give you that option, but the other piece is understanding how this is why we're dismissing other economic systems, because we don't want to entertain the notion that we can actually start to figure out ways to save one another and to think about other people's health beyond our own. We can actually start to think about ways to assist other people. We can think about ways to think about how the true meaning of public health is you're not just doing things that help you, you're doing things that will help the rest of the neighborhood, the rest of the community, the rest of the town. Because the bottom line is, any one of these viruses, if it can be transmitted from person to person, that means we're all in danger. If it's airborne, that means we're all in danger. If there is some type of contact, that means we're all in danger. And the minute that people start to recognize that, which is a very socialistic perspective, by the way, then the minute they can start to change their behaviors, where they're not just changing them to protect themselves, but they're changing them to protect all of us, because all of us are in danger. Doesn't that make sense? It makes sense to me. That's why I want to go to Cuba, so I can actually experience real public health, because I have yet to experience it in the US. So, with that, we encourage you all to increase your political education. The lies are just going to keep coming, you all. They are going to keep coming, and they are going to come because they want you to maintain your ignorance. You have got to understand that. They want you to maintain your ignorance. The more you don't have in terms of information, the better off they are with fooling you, manipulating you, lying to you. And as far as we're concerned, being in a relationship with capitalist US is like being in a relationship with someone who does not value you in any means at all, but you stay with them because you probably think you can't do better. That's not true. If you increase your political education, that means you're putting yourself back out there to learn what your values are and to learn what your beliefs are. That means that you're introducing yourself to yourself, basically. And by increasing your political education, you're enabling yourself to have more empowerment. And you're basically teaching yourself you can do better. You can do better than capitalism. Trust when we say that. Ashe.
Ashe, obrigada. Asante Sana, thank you, Shakura. And I want to apologize to you for the missing slides. I know it really made it more difficult for you to do your part. I'm not really sure what happened. I remember putting them in there, but that's on me. So my apologies for that. And I also want to build on something that you said that I think is so very important, because on this program, we really try to stick to practical analysis. And we also are committed to addressing confusion the best way that we possibly can. So I think it's important to build on the important point that you made and to talk about capitalism as an economic system and that its primary function as it relates to these questions of how people operate in it, the primary role of the state in a capitalist system is to suppress and oppress the masses of people. The role of the state in a capitalist society is focused upon serving the interests of multinational corporations. And since those interests are in direct contradiction to the interests of the majority of people on earth, the role of the state is specifically to ensure that those masses of people are never in the position where they can organize and do anything to threaten the capitalist monopoly over the state apparatus. So this is why health institutions in capitalist societies are focused on controlling, not necessarily healing people, but controlling the ability of people to have agency in their healthcare. That's why police agencies in capitalist societies are all about repression, right? All of the institutions. Name one institution in a capitalist society that's not about repression. That's their role. And then, like Shakur said, the socialist revolution aspect in socialism, socialist development, the role of the state is to transform its primary function of oppression that I just mentioned to serving the people. So in a socialist society, the state is transformed into a vehicle to serve the interests of the people. So using the example of socialist Cuba that Shakur mentioned, the healthcare apparatus is radically transformed. Healthcare is universally free, for example, as opposed to having to pay for private insurance coverage. Healthcare is universally free, which literally means you walk into a health entity, you get treatment, and you don't pay a dime ever. And so that's how it's radically transformed to serve the interests of the people. That's the role of the state in a socialist society. Now, communism comes a period after that, because in a communist society, you have raised the level of consciousness among the masses of people to a point where there is no longer any need for state apparatus. So when Karl Marx talked about the withering away of the state, what he's talking about is in a socialist transition period, you're setting up institutions that are designed to live their purposes and vanish once the people develop a level of consciousness so that the state apparatus is no longer needed. There's no longer a need for an apparatus to ensure there's health care, because the doctors in your society already understand from a conscious level that their primary responsibility is making sure everybody is healthy. So you don't need a state to make healthcare free. It's automatically going to be free based on the consciousness of the healthcare professionals. That's a communist society, and that has never happened. We don't have that level of consciousness. And these basic definitions, that's why they're so important, because if you don't understand what I just laid out, then like Shakur said, you'll be easily confused when people say, well, communism doesn't work. You won't even have enough knowledge about it to know that, well, we've never gotten to the point where it was in action. So we can't be talking about something not working that's never had the conditions to even function yet. So this is why this question of political education is so important, because the reason why I can articulate it just off the top of my head like that is not because I'm smarter than anyone else. It's because I've spent years practicing, studying, and understanding it. And that's what we do. That's why we promote that process of political education so much, because we know that this is the route to get us out of this confusion. And so on that, we'll talk about the myths and truths about Africa and AIDS. And so in the 80s and 90s, if you recall, and if you don't, you can look back at it, the commonly perpetuated myth is that the acquired immunity deficiency disease, or AIDS, started from monkeys in Africa. Now, of course, this was, for those of us who are old enough or have studied this was widely propagated in the 80s and 90s. It was propagated so much that it was passed off as irrefutable truth as to how the AIDS virus got started. there was never a shred of evidence provided to prove that theory, because it's not it wasn't grounded in any concrete history and analysis. It was just grounded in a racist narrative that was designed to further discredit African people in Africa. So nothing beyond, as it says there, bars or footstool talk was this ever proven. But this was passed off as the common explanation for where the AIDS virus came from. And I know people don't remember this or understand it because just a couple of years ago with the COVID virus, similar anti-Chinese propaganda was passed off as the common explanation for how the COVID virus was spread, that it started in the Wuhan province in China. And I heard people repeating that all to people that couldn't even point out China on a map, not to mention the Wuhan province, couldn't point out anything, couldn't tell you 3 sentences about China. But this is what someone told them, just like someone told them back in the 80s and 90s that a monkey from Africa produced the AIDS virus. And so this is what people believe. So this is why, this talk about political education is so critical. And, we'll say that we're not promoting the concept of polygamy. We don't do that. But at the same time, these same reactionary forces that promoted the monkey starting the AIDS virus, those same forces, capitalist propaganda forces, promoted the concept that the practice of polygamy in Africa, where a man can have in most countries up to 3, not most countries in Africa, but most countries that allow polygamy, up to 4 wives legally, that this was a primary contributor to the spread of the AIDS virus. And, without argument, that certainly made it easier for the virus to spread. No one is arguing against that. But to say that polygamous relationships in Africa was the primary reason for the spread of AIDS, which is what all of these so-called international health organizations were attempting to argue in the 80s and 90s. Again, no evidence of that whatsoever. No evidence. There was a lot of talk, and this is something I can't say that I've explored this deeply because I'm not really someone that spends a lot of time on conspiracy theories. I don't have to, because the analysis of what's happening in the world is clear for those who just look at it. So I don't need conspiracy theories. But one of the things that was said a lot was that the AIDS virus had the manifestations of chemical warfare. And that, at least that part, is not a dramatic claim to make. Think about it for a second. A virus that attacks the body's immunity system and makes it impossible for the body to engage in its natural healing processes. That's what you got to understand about AIDS. It wasn't necessarily AIDS that killed people. What the AIDS did was diminish people's immunity system. And by doing that, people would die from things that they normally wouldn't die from. And that's what killed them during that time period. So many millions of people. So this does strike the image of a weapon that's produced for, whether you argue for population control, controlling certain populations. I don't know. I'm not an expert to argue that point, but I'm just saying that certainly there's a lot more analysis that needs to be placed into the reason for the dramatic spread of AIDS in Africa, which we'll talk more about, other than just blaming it all on polygamy. And, without question, AIDS has historically maintained a higher profile in Africa, but we would argue that more so than because of polygamy, the reason for this would be practical things that we can just think about and figure out without a lot of bluster and fanfare. Like, for example, pharmaceutical goods are not readily available in Africa. Most of the people back in the 80s and 90s, in order to afford the cocktail of drugs required to fight the HIV virus infection, um, it was expensive. And this is not something that the overwhelming majority of people in the world, not to mention Africa, would ever have had the resources to be able to afford. So, right there, that's going to contribute mightily to the proliferation of any disease. If people can't afford the mechanisms to halt the disease, that's exactly what's going to happen. And the monopolization of pharmacy goods within these countries is a primary contributor to that. And the fact that these medicines were limited all throughout Africa. Because a lot of people, if they had the access, just like people here, they would have been able to be like Magic Johnson and completely eradicate the disease or the virus from their bodies. But without the proper medical care and attention, which was the reality all throughout Africa, that was not something that was going to happen. And then just talking about the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and their dominance of African economies. Now, this is not something that anybody except African revolutionaries is talking about, and that's why we're here. And that's why we have the analysis we have. Because if you study what the IMF and the World Bank did, the way that they implemented their so-called structural adjustment programs all over Africa is that they go to these countries and basically extort them to take out loans from the IMF and World Bank in order for them to produce infrastructure that would benefit these capitalist corporations. And in exchange for that, the leaders of these African countries would get dividends paid to them. I mean, an entirely corrupt system is what was put in place. That's why you won't move us with this talk of trying to compare China to the Western capitalist imperialist countries. It is not. We're not advocating China's involvement in Africa. We're Pan-Africanists. We want Africa for the Africans. That's what we want. So we're not advocating. Don't walk away and lie and say that that's what we're advocating. But we also are not going to be driven to this anti-Chinese propaganda and told to our faces that Chinese engagement in Africa is exactly the same or worse than European capitalist engagement in Africa. That's a damn lie. Anybody saying that? China has contributed massive amounts of infrastructure to Africa in exchange for natural resources that they need to feed the billion people that they have in China. Western capitalist colonialization and slavery out of Africa has produced and contributed nothing to Africa. And today, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, their role in Africa has built upon that exploitation of Africa. You look at the case of Zambia in Southern Africa. In the 90s, Zambia had an IMF loan to build a water treatment plant in Zambia. And the country of Zambia was forced to pay the equivalent of US dollars, 4 out of every 10 US dollar to service this IMF loan in Africa. Meanwhile, during that period of time, Zambia had one of the highest, if not the highest, I can't remember, AIDS rates in the entire world, not to mention Africa, where about 3 or 4 out of 10 people in the entire country had the HIV virus in the Zambia. And during that time, the government paid only about 2 out of every 10 US dollars towards AIDS treatment. So they paid more money towards the creation of this water treatment plant that was created to provide potable water to corporate interests in Zambia, primarily mining interests, mining diamonds and those types of things, not to provide this water for the people to consume and utilize, and more double the amount of resources from a poor country were going towards that than towards that thing.
Comrade, We can't hear you. I just heard you talking about mining a second ago, but maybe try to back up a little bit and then try to test it out. It just went out maybe a second ago. Nothing yet.
How about
It
now?
might. Yes, thank you so
Okay.
much.
I don't know what happened. It was going fine. All right. So I don't know. Did you hear about Zambia? Did that come through?
No,
Okay.
not on my end.
Okay, so I was saying that Zambia is a country in Southern Africa, and the International Monetary Fund uh, made a loan to Zambia to build a water treatment plant that was built to service mining countries, capitalist mining countries, companies, sorry, in Zambia. And the country was forced to pay 4 out of 10 US dollars to service that IMF loan. And at the same time, Zambia had a rate of 3 out of 4 out of 10 people in the Zambia had the HIV virus, and the country could only afford to pay 2 out of every 10 US dollars for AIDS treatment. So my point is that these examples, IMF and World Bank in Africa, the question of the access of medicines, these are the primary reasons we would argue as to why AIDS has been able to spread so proliferate so badly all throughout the African continent. So is it sound still coming through okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. Okay. I don't know what happened there, but we'll just keep it going. All right. So today in Africa, basic resources like we're saying like birth control, condoms, etc., basic medicines are still very difficult to come by throughout most of Africa. And this, of course, continues to be a central issue. I mean, all you got to think about is yourself. You get a headache every day, drink, get a hangover, take aspirin. If you didn't have access to medication, that would drastically impact your life. So this is the reality for most of the people on the planet Earth. And AIDS, as a result of that, continues to be a major epidemic in Africa. According to the capitalist World Health Organization, in 2023, 9% of the new adult cases for AIDS were in Africa, while only 0.5% were in North America. These are cases as of 2023. So it's still a very dangerous disease as it exists today. But just because it's not a hot button issue in Western capitalist news, they're not talking about it because they don't care about Africa. That doesn't mean it's not a still issue. It's not still a major issue in colonized and marginalized communities. So without question, it is absolutely a hot button issue that's devastating our people. And it's also worth mentioning that there are areas in the southern US, including like in the region where Shakura is right now, where the AIDS rates actually rival the new AIDS case rates in Africa. And I mention that to make the point that we don't believe that that's incidental. We believe that the issues that we're raising, the access to quality health care, the access to medicines, these are issues that impact poor people everywhere, not just in Africa, but everywhere. And these are the disparate capabilities of people to gain access to these things are consistent with African people wherever we are on the planet Earth. So these are the reasons why, when it comes to things like the percentage of new AIDS cases, African people, wherever we are on Earth, we're always at the front of that line. And this has nothing to do with, it has everything to do with the economic exploitation that I just mentioned, and nothing to do with any immoral habits that our people have, because this is the narrative that's put out there. The reason why this is impacting us is because of the immorality of our people. And, polygamy is used in this example of that, and the behavior of our women is blamed for that, which is absolutely absurd. And all the while, the rich Europeans' daughter then had 5 or 6 cases of STDs,
5 or 6 abortions, and all of that is happening with all of those people, but they have the money to cover it up. And so you don't ever know about it. It's not ever reported the same way that our people's difficulties are reported. So a lot of you think because of that, that they don't have these problems. And these problems are just, I'm talking to you African people that repeat these backward talking points against our people because you don't have the ability or the willingness to make a serious analysis of these problems. And Kwame Ture already told us that any analysis of our people that doesn't include the oppressor is a backward analysis. I mean, you can't make any analysis. You can't say things like, well, reason why we have AIDS is because of our behavior. And then that analysis doesn't include anything about the forces that oppress us. So it's a stupid analysis, plain and simple. It doesn't include any of the things that we've been talking about during this episode, which are critical issues as it relates to this question of why disease spreads in Africa, not just HIV, but all of the diseases that exist there, yellow fever, malaria, all of these things result because the resources in Africa are used to enrich the super rich. They are not used to serve the interests of the masses of people in Africa. That's irrefutable to anyone who spends even a cursory amount of time studying what's going on in Africa. So this is what we have to be able to recognize and explain to people so that we can stamp out this nonsense about why these things continue to happen at home. And of course, this is exactly the reason why we need Pan-Africanism and why we fight for it. We look again to socialist Cuba. And as Shakur said, they have been able to effectively eradicate mother-to-child HIV infections in Cuba. And they're one of the very first countries to do that. And the significance of that is that they did it while suffering under the conditions of the economic blockade imposed by the United States of America against Cuba since 1962, the year I was born, 62 years, that Cuba has been unable to purchase pharmaceuticals on the international market. So they never have had the cocktail medications that Magic Johnson took. They never had access to that. And if they did, it was on such a small scale that they weren't able to utilize it for any significant number of people. A lot of the success that they have made has been the result of their innovative biomedical industry in Cuba, where they've used plant life and the medicinal capacities of plants and transferred that into effective treatments for any number of diseases and health issues. And this is something that's lauded even by the capitalists, like the World Health Organization, even health societies in the US. They're going to Cuba. If I were the Cubans, I'd say, you're not welcome to come study our medicine, but that's not the spirit of the Cuban Revolution. They let these no good bastards into the country to study what they've done with this biomedical field and to bring it back so that they could figure out a way to produce it here and profit off of it. So this is why it's important for us to understand this, because Cuba has been able to accomplish this while being a small island, a small poor island of 11 million people that produces a very limited amount of goods that can bring them back any substantial dividend on the world market. Because of the blockade, a majority of countries that have the capacity to engage in serious trade are not permitted to even do business with Cuba. But even despite of all of this, look what they've been able to accomplish as it relates to healthcare. There is no country in the Western Hemisphere, including the United States of America and Canada, the two most industrialized countries in the Western Hemisphere. Not even those two can compare to the progress that's been made with Cuba's healthcare system, a poor country. So imagine if they're able to do that with a limited capacity to produce resources. How are they able to do it then? The reason why they're able to do it is because of their socialist system. They have a socialist system there, which means that the people are morally incented, not materially incented. They have a desire to solve the problems that impact the people. They get joy and they get a sense of accomplishment in life by creating solutions such as the biomedical field to address the problems their people face, and that gives them a sense of accomplishment in life. And so they're highly motivated to come up with those solutions. And I understand that because I'm highly motivated by material incentives, and I'm motivated by the ability to come up with solutions to address the problems that people make. I don't have to be paid to do that. I'm not interested in that. That's not the motivation for me. But in a capitalist society, if you ain't paying me, I'm not going to do it. I'm not even going to think about it. You know, when people say things like, I work according to what I'm paid, that's what you're saying, is that you have to be materially incented. And I'm not criticizing people for saying that, because people are viciously exploited in capitalist societies. So it's a survival mechanism to say that. We totally get that, but we're trying to just make the point that under socialism, people are morally incented, and that allows people's creativity to expand and produce solutions to problems, because that creativity isn't exploited, it isn't subverted, it isn't repressed so that people can control you in the work site. It's encouraged so that problems can be solved. And this is what the Cubans have been able to accomplish with their small, poor, island country of 11 million people. Now, take that model to Africa, where we have 1 billion people. We have another billion plus people outside of Africa. We have all the resources in the world to solve any problem that we have on the planet Earth. The only thing missing from that equation is socialism. If we had socialism all over Africa, there would be no problems like this in Africa today. I mean, you cannot argue against that. All you got to do, again, is look at what Cuba's accomplished. We know what we're talking about. If you don't understand this, that's your damn problem. Do the work so you can understand it. You can't sit here and argue with us. You know, I had a clown the other day. I mentioned that, you know, I study Cuba a lot and I've gone there, and well, why would you do that? And I said, well, so I don't sound stupid like you do right now. And the people around laughed. He's like, well, you don't have to be insulted. I'm like, you insulted yourself. You know, it's just like Shakur and I were laughing about the Rush Hour movie and the scene where Chris Tucker, Don Cheadle's, owns a Chinese restaurant, and Don Cheadle says, "You embarrassing me," and Chris Tucker said, "You embarrassing yourself. You're a black man with a Chinese restaurant on Crenshaw in L.A." Well, that's what I told this guy. You embarrassing yourself sounded so damn stupid. You know, you just told us you haven't studied it, you haven't read a single book about Cuba, you haven't been there, but yet you're questioning why I would go there. That's stupid as hell. I can't think of a better example of stupidity. Well, why don't you tell them? Like, I'm not your tutor. That's your problem now. You're constantly looking for the easy way out. Open a goddamn book and read it for a change. And try that route. Try that. You know, instead of trying to be intellectually lazy and then argumentative when you get called on it. So this is what we're saying, you all, is that one unified socialist Africa solves our problems like this. You know, the shortage of resources is the irrefutable manifestation of this uneven exploitation against Africa and Africans by the capitalist empire. That's why we need one unified socialist Africa. We need the kind of central coordination that an all African committee for political coordination, which unites all of the Pan-African revolutionary formations on the ground in Africa into the All African People's Revolutionary Party in its completed manifestation, and the All African People's Revolutionary Army. That's why we need that. because that'll ensure that the resources are provided where needed. And scientific socialism, as the example I just gave you, ensures we can develop the type of doctor-patient equity in Africa that we see in Cuba, in socialist Cuba. And not only can we do that, but we can provide, if Cuba can send doctors as poor as they are, but because of their socialist model, to 30 countries in Africa, imagine what we could do with one unified socialist Africa. And you ask us why we're revolutionary Pan-Africanists. We thank you for joining us. We want to invite you back next week, Sunday, December 22nd. We're going to be talking about the lost and found Jesus Christ. We're going to be talking about how Jesus is supposed to be the reason for the season, but most of these people claiming that in these churches are talking about everything except what Jesus, if Jesus were living today, would believe. So join us next week when we talk about that. And then the upper left-hand corner QR code, you can get the other AAPRP programs. Shakur played a snippet before we started today. I can't remember if it was the Pontula podcast or if it was Forward Ever, one of the two. But those are other AAPRP programs, and there are other ones as well as this one, Our Ancestors' Voices. So we encourage you to check that QR code, scan it rather, and get that. And the Forward Ever shop, they have new clothes up there, y'all. You know you're gonna be spending your money for this capitalist holiday. I just bought a hoodie, Shakura, that they have up there. It has Malcolm X on it, his picture, and it has quotations that he's making supporting Pan-Africanism, because Malcolm X was without question a revolutionary Pan-Africanist. So go to the Forward Ever shop in the QR code there and buy there, support revolutionary organization, hoodcommunist.org. I just wrote an article and sent it in today, and if the ancestors are willing and they see value in it, I hope that it's able to be shared. I appreciate them. They provide information. It's our blog, you all, so let's support it, all right? And then we want to invite you here in Sacramento, those of you in Northern California, on February 1st, we're having a community discussion. We want to invite everyone to come out. 2025 and a Fascist Empire, a discussion on how those concerned in the African, quote unquote, Black community should build and respond. And so the information is there. You can reach out to us if you want more information about that. Join the APRP at aprp-intl.org, aprp-intl.org, and contribute to the APRP at Venmo at A-APRP, and then PayPal at AAPRP. We thank you for that. And then the bottom right QR code, the black and white one, you can support Burkina Books. One of our comrades from Burkina Faso is coming here next week, and look forward to hearing the updates on the work we're doing on the ground there, the work happening in the Sahel region, as well as this comrade works for Africa Stream. So hearing an update on that. So look forward to getting that information. And at the upper right, I have my book, A Guide for Organizing Defense Against White Supremacist, Patriarchal, and Fascist Violence, A Guide for Organizing Defense Against White Supremacist, Patriarchal, and Fascist Violence. Only $8 on the, unfortunately, the only way you can get it is through Amazon.com. But the book has never been needed, I believe, more than it is now. I mean, we're facing these times where we are going to need to organize as never before to defend ourselves and to build the types of movements we have. And that's really what the book is designed to do, is talk in concrete terms about how we do those two things. If it's 2025 and the only security process you have is dialing 911, you are a lost soul. And those of you that pray, you should pray for people that that's their only process to defend themselves. We have to do way better than that. And that's what the book is designed to promote. And like I've said many times, I use all the proceeds to finance I'm being asked to do all these trainings. Some of the people have money to compensate expenses. A lot of them don't. either way, I'm going to say yes, and I'm going to do my best to go. But the way that I finance that is through these resources. So help me be able to do that. Help us be able to build further capacity. Forward ever, backwards never. Enjoy the rest of your evening.